I had barely turned the key in my front door after a 2-month overseas deployment when I noticed steam rising behind my guesthouse like something out of a cheap horror movie. At first, I thought maybe a pipe had burst or someone left the grill running, but the scent in the air was unmistakable: lavender and eucalyptus. Confused, I dropped my duffel bag and followed the mist like a detective in a noir film. Rounding the corner, I stopped dead in my tracks. There it was, humming like a mechanical beast. A luxury hot tub, bubbling and glowing like a Vegas fountain, complete with champagne glasses, LED lights, and the kicker, a giant pink towel embroidered with the words Karen's Oasis hanging from a hook screwed into my fence. My fence. That was the exact moment I realized someone had moved into my yard like it was a vacation rental, and I hadn't even unpacked my socks yet. It wasn't just the hot tub that had magically appeared. A path of stepping stones had been neatly laid through the grass, leading from the tub to a freshly cut hole in my back hedge. My property line was well known and clearly marked, but someone had gone ahead and not only trespassed but treated my backyard like a spa retreat. It would have been laughable if it wasn't so absolutely insane. I followed the path like I was in a fairy tale, half expecting a gnome to jump out and offer me cucumber water. But what I found was worse, much worse. The path ended at the backyard gate of none other than Karen Prescott, the infamous HOA vice president and neighborhood tyrant who once fined a family for having a garden gnome that looked sarcastic. Karen was out on her patio sipping from a mimosa flute, completely relaxed like she hadn't just annexed part of someone else's land. She saw me and raised a perfectly manicured hand in a mock wave that dripped with smugness. I was still standing there trying to process whether I was dreaming or had wandered onto a movie set when she called out, "Oh, you're back. I hope you don't mind. I thought that corner wasn't being used." I blinked. "That corner? You mean my property?" She smiled wider. "You weren't even here. And the HOA board agreed it was an eyesore. I decided to beautify it. You're welcome." Then she turned her back to me and vanished inside her house, as if that explained everything, and my stunned silence meant I was cool with it. I wasn't. Oh, I very much wasn't. I walked back to the bubbling spa monstrosity, now acutely aware that the jets were still running. Who was paying for that power? The water? My utilities were connected to this side. Crouched down and followed the line. Sure enough, it had been rigged into my outdoor outlet box. She had the audacity to leech off my grid while bathing in eucalyptus like she was royalty. I took a few photos. Then I took a deep breath and did what every rational man does when confronted by the HOA queen's insanity. I checked the footage on my outdoor camera system. And there it was. 2 weeks ago, a crew showed up with a flatbed truck, hot tub parts, and Karen directing them in a wide-brimmed sun hat like she was filming an HGTV special. She stood right where I was standing, hands on her hips, pointing to a sketch on a clipboard. They had worked for 2 days installing it, on my land, while I was overseas installing satellites over Europe. They cut into my hedge, ran cable across my lawn, and didn't leave a single note. I didn't scream. I didn't rage. I simply smiled, walked back into my house, opened my filing cabinet, and pulled out the thick folder labeled Property Survey. It included the land plat, blueprints, GPS coordinates, and, best of all, the original title deed from before this HOA even existed. My grandfather's name was on it. This land was mine, legally and undeniably, and Karen's little jungle retreat was planted smack in the middle of it. I wasn't just going to get the hot tub removed. I was going to make her wish she'd never bought those monogram towels. Before I took legal action, I decided to give her one last chance to fix it. I walked up to her door the next morning, knocked, and waited. She opened it in a silk robe, eyes barely open, holding a coffee mug that said, "World's Best HOA VP." I said, as politely as I could muster, that the hot tub was installed without permission on my private land, and I wanted it removed immediately. Karen laughed. Not a nervous laugh or a regretful chuckle, but a full-on witch cackle that echoed down the street. "You think this is your land?" she said. "That little wedge has always been up for community use. We just enhanced it. I spoke to the HOA. They're fine with it. You were gone. It's done." I asked if she had anything in writing. She waved her hand. "Verbal agreement. HOA tradition. It's practically law here." I left without another word, because she had just given me all the ammunition I needed. I went home and called my lawyer. He answered on the second ring and nearly dropped his phone laughing when I explained. He told me to send him everything: survey scans, footage, utility records, and said this was the easiest trespassing and civil liability case he'd had in years. Then he added, if she's used HOA funds, we might be looking at misappropriation charges. I smiled, uploaded the documents to the shared folder, and then installed a motion-triggered sprinkler system pointed directly at the spa. Karen came out later that day in a bathing suit, ready for another soak, and got blasted full force with cold water the second she stepped onto the pavers. The scream was incredible. Neighbors peeped through blinds. Karen stormed over to my house, dripping and furious, demanding I remove my illegal water trap. I said, "On my land? I don't think so." The war had begun, and she didn't even realize I was about to hit her with a tsunami of legal and public humiliation. She'd picked the wrong neighbor to steamroll. The only thing she'd be soaking in soon was regret. The morning after Karen's sprinkler showdown, I stood on the edge of my property sipping coffee like I was surveying a battlefield. Her precious hot tub still sat there, humming quietly, like a smug guest that refused to leave. The sprinklers had done their job in the short term, but I knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat, especially not publicly. She was the kind of person who would rather set herself on fire than let someone else have the last word. I needed something stronger than sprinklers. I needed undeniable proof and official enforcement. So, I made a call to the county assessor's office and scheduled a fresh land survey. I already had all the documents from my grandfather's original plat and my recent updates, but I wanted this to be bulletproof. Meanwhile, I reviewed my camera footage again, checking timestamps, faces, and even plate numbers of the installation crew. Everything was meticulous. She hadn't even tried to hide it. That smug sense of entitlement radiated from every second of the footage. It made my case airtight, but it also made me realize how deeply Karen believed she could get away with anything. 2 days later, a licensed surveyor named Marco arrived with his drone equipment and digital mapping gear. We walked the perimeter of my property, and I showed him where the spa had been installed. As soon as he saw the setup, he shook his head and laughed softly, then got to work planting temporary flags along the actual property line. Within the hour, it was undeniable. The hot tub was not just on my land, it was nearly 7 feet past the legal boundary. The fence she had built behind it? Also mine. Even the paver path was almost entirely outside her lot. Karen had basically built her own private spa resort using my land as her foundation. When Marco wrapped up, he handed me a signed report with GPS coordinates, timestamp drone photos, and satellite overlays. I took one look at it and grinned. It was time to hit the next phase. My lawyer filed an official cease and desist notice that same afternoon. I had it served directly to Karen with a delivery confirmation. Of course, she didn't take it quietly. I was sitting on my porch the next morning when I saw her storm out of her house in full makeup, clutching the envelope like it was radioactive. She crossed into my yard, yelling loud enough for the whole block to hear, calling the letter a forgery and claiming she would personally see to it that my illegal campaign of harassment ended immediately. I didn't even stand up. I just pointed to the blinking red light on the security camera above my door and said, very calmly, that she was trespassing again. Her face twitched, and for a moment I thought she might explode. Instead, she spun around and marched back to her house, nearly tripping over her own paver path. A few hours later, I got an email from the HOA board requesting my attendance at their emergency meeting to discuss neighborhood peace and usage disputes. I smiled. That was exactly what I wanted. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse. I hadn't stepped foot inside it since the HOA formed years ago and began slowly trying to take over the area like a regulatory cult. I walked in with a thick binder of evidence, a hard drive, and 3 copies of the surveyor's signed map. Karen was already there, seated in front like she was the main act. The moment I entered, she loudly accused me of being hostile and unneighborly. The board president, a soft-spoken man named Dennis who looked permanently confused, tried to shush her, but she kept going, ranting about how I didn't appreciate neighborhood improvements and how she had transformed an ugly patch of weeds into something usable for all. I asked if I could speak. Dennis gestured for me to go ahead. I walked to the front and calmly plugged my hard drive into the projector. First, I played the drone footage from the county survey, showing in clear, irrefutable lines exactly where the property boundaries fell. Then I pulled up the installation video from my home cameras, time-stamped and zoomed in to show Karen directing the crew and trespassing onto my land. Then I handed out the printed documents showing the original deed, updated county registration, and electrical usage pulled directly from my smart meter log. There was a long silence when I finished. Karen tried to protest, but one of the board members interrupted her and asked if what I showed was fake. She froze. Someone else leaned in and asked, quietly, if it was true she used HOA funds to install the hot tub. Another silence. Then she snapped, saying it was within budgetary discretion, and that the funds were used for beautification as permitted under Article 7 of the Community Covenant. That was her first mistake. Because I had brought a copy of Article 7, and nowhere did it mention beautification projects involving the private property of non-HOA landowners. I left the meeting knowing Karen was cornered. What I didn't expect was the aftermath. Later that day, neighbors started quietly messaging me. Some thanked me. Others shared stories of Karen's petty rule enforcement. One woman told me Karen had once fined her for having a bird feeder too close to her gutter. Another guy said he'd been reported for leaving his recycling bin out past 9 a.m. People were fed up, and my situation had finally given them the spark to say something. But Karen wasn't done. That night, she blasted music from her backyard spa area and invited what must have been 20 people over. The hot tub was overflowing, the wine was flowing, and her guests were loud, trashy, and completely unaware they were sitting illegally on someone else's land. I didn't interfere. I just watched from my security feed, noting every timestamp and preparing the next set of reports. At 11 p.m., a drunk guest wandered into my yard and urinated on my generator. That was the moment I decided kindness was over. I upgraded the motion sprinkler system to full-pressure oscillating heads, installed 2 more cameras with infrared sensors, and left a large, waterproof sign near the boundary that read, "Private property. Under surveillance. Trespassers will be prosecuted." The following morning, the spa area was a soaked mess. Karen came out with a hairdryer, trying to save her monogram towels while cursing under her breath. She was soaked again before she could finish. Later that day, she filed another complaint with the HOA, this time alleging harassment. But now the board was hesitant. They'd seen the footage. They'd seen the documents. I wasn't the problem anymore. She was. By the end of the week, the board sent Karen a notice requesting full documentation of the hot tub installation, including all financial transactions, HOA approvals, and community input. She replied with a hastily written email that included vague references to past meetings, none of which were recorded or confirmed. The cracks were showing. The board members had begun asking each other questions. One even reached out to me directly, saying he believed Karen had misused discretionary funds and asked if I would be willing to share my utility logs. I said I'd be happy to. All of them. By now, the hot tub had become a neighborhood punchline. Kids started referring to it as the forbidden pool. One guy walked his dog past it and yelled out, "Hey Karen, is it your land if no one believes you?" She screamed back something unintelligible, and the poor man. 2 days after the HOA meeting, Karen made it clear that if she was going down, she'd go down screaming. That morning, I found a stack of flyers wedged into every mailbox on the block, printed in large bold font with the title, "The Truth About My Neighbor's Campaign of Harassment." Each page was a ranting manifesto filled with lies, half-baked conspiracy theories, and accusations that I was sabotaging neighborhood unity and using advanced surveillance techniques to intimidate innocent families. According to Karen's rambling diatribe, I was a rogue vigilante bent on destroying the community's harmony simply because I didn't like spa culture. One neighbor, Linda, stopped me while I was walking to my mailbox and asked if I really had drones flying over her pool. I nearly choked laughing and assured her that my drone was used once, by a licensed surveyor, with county approval. She nodded and rolled her eyes, saying, "I figured. Karen's losing it." It seemed the more she tried to convince everyone I was a villain, the more she exposed herself as the problem. The most ironic part was that I hadn't even responded publicly. I had stayed quiet, stuck to legal paths, documented everything, and let Karen unravel herself. But she couldn't handle that silence. She needed a fight. So she tried to provoke one. That evening, she hosted another spa party, this time with speakers turned up so loud it rattled my windows. Guests trampled through my lawn, ignoring my boundary flags and signs. One guy dragged a folding chair onto my grass like it was his personal lawn. When I politely informed him he was on private property, he muttered something about "Karen said it was fine," and went back to sipping from his red Solo cup. I called the non-emergency police line and requested an officer to document the trespass. When the officer arrived, Karen rushed outside before I could say a word, performing her best suburban soap opera scene, accusing me of harassing her guests, violating community peace, and even suggesting I had threatened to poison her hot tub. The officer raised an eyebrow, turned to me, and asked calmly if I had anything to say. I handed him a printout of the property survey, the police report number from the previous trespass incident, and a copy of the cease and desist letter served by my lawyer. I also showed him the camera footage from 15 minutes prior, clearly showing Karen's guests entering my lawn. The officer thanked me, walked back to Karen, and in the most professional voice possible told her that she was on thin ice legally and should strongly reconsider her actions. Karen's face twitched again, that same twitch from the sprinkler incident. But instead of backing down, she went further. She called the HOA emergency hotline and claimed I was creating hostile living conditions. The officer gave me an apologetic look before leaving, and Karen stood in her driveway, victorious for a moment, hands on her hips as if she'd just won a battle. But her moment wouldn't last. The next day, I was at my computer reviewing utility logs when I noticed a spike in electricity use around 3 a.m. My system recorded the data in 15-minute intervals, and there had been a sudden power drain from the outdoor panel that only fed two things: my detached garage and the outlet Karen had illegally tapped for the hot tub. I checked the camera feed and saw shadows moving behind the fence line. Karen or someone she hired had been back there, possibly tampering with the wiring. Furious, I checked the line and found it had been rerouted again, this time hidden behind some decorative stones. She had tried to cover it up to make it look like a legitimate setup from her side. That was enough. I forwarded everything to my lawyer, and this time, we filed not only for a formal lawsuit but also for an emergency injunction to prevent further tampering. I was done playing nice. Later that evening, Karen struck again, but this time publicly. She stood at the entrance of the weekly community block event, holding a clipboard and shouting into a megaphone about land theft, masquerading tech vigilantes, and even claimed I was building a radiation tower in my garage. Parents were pulling their kids away from her. Teens were filming her rant for TikTok. She looked unhinged, wild hair blowing in the wind, and not a single person was taking her seriously. But she wasn't embarrassed. She was emboldened, thinking that if she screamed loud enough, people would stop looking at the evidence and just believe her noise. But the problem with Karen's plan was that I had the receipt. Every single one of them. The next morning, I sent out a calm, respectful message to the entire neighborhood mailing list. I attached the property line report, documentation of the utilities, photos of the wiring, and a list of violations including trespass, tampering, and unauthorized use of private land. I didn't attack her. I simply presented facts. I ended the message by offering an open invitation to any neighbor who wanted to walk the property line with me and see for themselves. To my surprise, 6 people showed up that afternoon. I took them around, pointed to the spray-painted markers, showed them the boundary maps, and explained everything. Every single one of them nodded in disbelief, apologizing for ever doubting me, and admitted that Karen had been running the HOA like her personal fiefdom for too long. One neighbor said, "Honestly, we thought you were being petty at first, but now I see she's completely crossed the line, literally." As word spread, more people turned against her. The HOA board held a second emergency session, this time without Karen present, to review whether funds had been misused. The treasurer confirmed what I had suspected all along. Karen had submitted reimbursement requests for materials, landscaping labor, and even a Bluetooth speaker system labeled as Community Sound Enhancement. The board was silent. Then someone asked if any of these expenditures had been approved in writing or by vote. They hadn't. The fallout was immediate. The board suspended Karen's authority pending investigation, and the HOA's lawyer got involved. But even then, Karen refused to let go. That evening, she returned home to find her hot tub cord severed by the utility company. She screamed loud enough that I heard it from inside my house with the windows closed. Then, at around midnight, I caught her on camera, again, trying to plug it into a backup generator she had wheeled into her backyard. By this point, I had installed a perimeter alert system. I watched her fumble with the plug, get zapped by a surge, and stumble backward into her lawn flamingos. She cursed the sky, blamed me, the HOA, the power company, and probably gravity. But the recording was gold. I emailed it to my lawyer with the subject line, "Karen vs. Electricity, Round 3. The next day, Karen came knocking, not to apologize but to try to negotiate. She had the audacity to ask if I'd be willing to share the land. She suggested we create a joint community spa zone, install benches, and maybe split the maintenance fees. I didn't even respond. I closed the door in her face and forwarded the interaction to the HOA. That week ended with Karen being served again, this time for property damage and utility theft. The HOA officially announced a full audit of all project funds from the past 2 years. Karen responded by locking herself inside her house, closing her. 3 days after the HOA began auditing its accounts and Karen's precious hot tub had gone cold, the tension in the neighborhood felt like it was about to snap. People weren't just gossiping anymore. They were actively whispering in front of Karen's house, pointing, pausing during dog walks, and even taking slow drive-bys with their phones angled suspiciously toward her yard. The quiet fury that once simmered in Karen's little kingdom had boiled over, and now she was trapped in the castle she built on someone else's land. But instead of retreating gracefully, she doubled down like someone who still believed the rules didn't apply to her. She hadn't left the house in 2 days, yet her backyard was alive at night with light, sound, and the unmistakable clanging of tools. I suspected she was up to something, and my cameras confirmed it. Around 1 a.m., Karen emerged into the dark with a flashlight taped to her head, dragging something heavy across the yard. She had on gardening gloves, slippers, and what looked like a painter's apron. She wheeled out a massive new generator and began reconnecting it to the hot tub, trying to bypass the disconnected power lines. The motion sensor lights kicked on. She froze like a deer caught stealing electricity. The cameras caught everything, from her fumbling with wires to the brief but glorious moment when the generator backfired and belched smoke straight into her face. She coughed, cursed loudly, kicked the machine, and stomped back into the house, leaving the generator sputtering like a dying lawnmower. It was a fitting soundtrack to the chaos she'd created. The next morning, I handed over the footage to both my lawyer and the HOA's legal representative, who now had a growing file labeled Karen, Incident Log. They thanked me and informed me that the audit had already revealed enough discrepancies to warrant a full disciplinary vote among board members. Karen's chair position was suspended indefinitely, and she would be forced to attend a hearing. Still, she wasn't giving up. That afternoon, while I was trimming hedges near the border, she shouted over the fence. Her tone was oddly polite, sugar-coated with false sincerity. She asked if we could talk. Against my better judgment, I agreed. She met me at the edge of the property with a forced smile and a basket of store-bought cookies. She said she wanted to make amends, and that this whole situation had gotten out of hand. She spoke about the spirit of the community and how neighbors should work together. I waited patiently, listening, giving her the benefit of the doubt for exactly 90 seconds. Then she slipped in the real motive. She said if I agreed to grant her a small easement, she'd not only remove the hot tub voluntarily but would also publicly apologize and request the board drop all investigations. I stared at her, trying not to laugh. She wanted me to grant her the right to use my land, after stealing it, wiring into it, soaking in it, and then accusing me of harassment. I told her no, plainly and without emotion. Her face fell. She muttered something about how I'd regret this decision, then turned and walked off, still carrying the basket of cookies. She couldn't even follow through on the apology gift. That evening, she made her most dramatic move yet. She invited local news. I didn't even know who tipped them off, but around sunset, a reporter and camera crew showed up at her house. Karen was already on her patio in full makeup, standing beside her silent hot tub like it was a fallen hero. She spun a narrative of how she was being bullied by a reclusive neighbor with too much money and not enough community spirit. She accused me of stalking her, weaponizing my cameras, and hoarding land that could benefit the neighborhood. It was delusional and wildly inaccurate. The news crew filmed her sob story, complete with dramatic sighs and gestures toward the deactivated hot tub. I watched from a distance, arms crossed, already pulling up my folder of documentation. To their credit, the news crew came to me next. They wanted my side. I welcomed them into my home, offered them a seat, and presented every piece of evidence: time-stamped footage, the survey map, the power records, and a printed report from the HOA showing the misuse of funds. The reporter's eyebrows rose higher with each new page. She thanked me for my time and said they'd include both perspectives. When the piece aired that night, it was brutally clear. Karen's segment came off unhinged and incoherent. My part was calm, clear, and supported by hard evidence. The news station even interviewed a few neighbors who were more than happy to share their own run-ins with Karen's nonsense. By the next day, Karen had become a local meme. Someone printed a photo of her standing by the hot tub with the words, "Queen of someone else's land," and taped it to the community bulletin board. She tore it down, of course, but it reappeared twice more that week. At this point, the hot tub was more symbolic than functional. It had become a monument to entitlement, a shrine to Karen's belief that rules didn't apply to her. I finally decided to make a move of my own. With legal approval and sheriff documentation, I scheduled the removal of the hot tub. I posted a notice on the fence the day before, informing Karen that the unauthorized structure would be removed by court order unless she did it herself. She ignored it, of course. So, at 10 a.m. sharp the next morning, a truck and crane pulled up in front of my house. Word had spread, and several neighbors stood on sidewalks with coffee in hand like it was a Saturday parade. The crane operator lowered the arm, latched onto the tub, and lifted it like a spaceship being taken back to its home planet. Karen burst out of her house screaming. She demanded the crew stop, claimed it was theft, threatened lawsuits, and even tried to climb onto the crane platform. The sheriff's deputy calmly stepped in and read the court order aloud. Karen stood frozen, mascara streaking, realizing there was nothing she could do. The hot tub dangled for a moment in the air, then slowly rotated over my driveway as the truck prepared to haul it off. The crew didn't even flinch. They loaded it onto the flatbed, secured it, and drove off, leaving a square patch of damp, ruined grass behind. I stood at the edge of the property with the signed removal receipt in hand, while Karen retreated to her house like a defeated queen cast out of her castle. That evening, I hosted a small barbecue on the freshly reclaimed corner. I set up folding chairs, a grill, and even a rented bubble machine as a joke. Neighbors stopped by one, many bringing drinks and desserts. We laughed, shared stories, and someone even brought a Bluetooth speaker that played spa music. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Someone asked if I'd ever consider installing my own hot tub there. I said no. I think I'd had enough steam for one lifetime. As the sun dipped below the fence line, laughter echoed through the yard that Karen once tried to claim, and I finally felt peace creeping back into the soil. Karen may have lost the battle for the hot tub, but what followed was a campaign of quiet chaos. With the tub gone and the neighborhood turned against her, you'd think she would lay low, reflect, maybe even apologize. But instead, she retreated into her house like a villain licking her wounds, plotting something behind closed curtains and drawn blinds. For a week, there was no sign of her except for the occasional flicker of her living room TV and the daily HOA complaint emails she continued to file. Now she wasn't just targeting me, she was reporting everyone. A trash bin left out too long. A lawn not trimmed to regulation. A wind chime too loud. It was as if she was trying to claw back control by sheer paperwork. But people were no longer scared. They were irritated, amused, and increasingly vocal. The neighborhood, once polite and quiet, was now actively rejecting Karen's reign, and it wasn't just personal, it was structural. The HOA had changed. After the audit exposed her misuse of funds and manipulation of board processes, a special vote was held to remove her permanently from the HOA leadership. I wasn't a voting member since I wasn't technically under HOA jurisdiction, but I was invited to attend. The meeting was held outdoors under a rented tent in the park, and over 30 residents showed up, far more than usual. Several brought their own folding chairs and thermoses of coffee like it was a camping trip. When Karen arrived, dressed in a stiff blazer and oversized sunglasses, the air changed. There was no cheer, no sympathy. Just tension and long stares. She took her place at the front and began talking before anyone asked her to. She claimed the whole thing was a conspiracy, an act of retaliation, and that she had only tried to beautify the community and improve morale. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Hot tubs aren't morale, Karen." Laughter followed, and for the first time, Karen looked genuinely rattled. The vote was unanimous. She was stripped of all HOA authority and barred from handling neighborhood finances again. It was a clean, quiet coup. No shouting, no gloating, just a group of tired neighbors doing what needed to be done. Karen left mid-meeting, muttering something about hiring lawyers, but it was already too late. With her title gone, her grip on the community vanished. But that didn't mean she went quietly. She became more erratic in subtle ways. One morning, I found lawn clippings dumped across my driveway. Another day, someone knocked over my trash bins and smeared mud across the lid. The neighborhood chat group was flooded with passive-aggressive posts about vindictive neighbors and selfish landowners who don't understand community values. No names were ever mentioned, but no one had any doubt who was typing them. Things escalated one particularly windy afternoon when I discovered a makeshift sign posted right at the edge of my lawn. It read "Land of Pettiness, Private Property, No Joy Allowed." It was clearly Karen's handwriting. I took it down without a word, but I didn't ignore it. I began preparing for the final play, not revenge, but closure. Came to me one night while reviewing old survey documents. There had been rumors in the neighborhood about an old community covenant written decades ago before the current HOA existed, a document that, if still legally binding, could override HOA claims in certain boundary cases. I dug deeper and found it, a dusty file buried in the county's public records archive. It clearly stated that the original property boundaries, including the edge where Karen had built her hot tub, were protected as private homestead land, with no community encroachment allowed. That clause was never nullified, and I confirmed it with my lawyer. That meant Karen hadn't just trespassed, she had violated a long-standing legal agreement preserved by the county. Armed with that, I had a final letter sent to Karen's property. It wasn't aggressive, just formal and precise. It included a request for financial compensation for utility theft, land use, and damage, all backed by documentation. The amount wasn't astronomical, but it was enough to sting. She responded not with a check, but with a homemade video. She stood in her backyard, speaking directly to the camera, posting it on the neighborhood social page. She accused me of bullying, of exploiting legal loopholes, and called for a boycott of my family's local business. That backfired spectacularly. Within hours, neighbors flooded the comments defending me, reminding everyone of what Karen had done. Some even posted their own clips showing her yelling, damaging property, and ranting in public. It wasn't just a loss. It was a full digital dismantling of her reputation. A week later, I received a check in the mail for the exact amount I'd requested. No note, no apology, just a signature that barely looked legible. That same day, a moving truck pulled up to her driveway. The rumor mill fired up immediately. Some said she was selling, others said she'd be renting the place out. Either way, she was leaving, at least temporarily. A few neighbors stood quietly at their doors, watching as boxes were loaded and furniture hauled out. No one said goodbye. She got in her car, stared out at the homes she used to lord over, and drove off without a single glance toward the corner of the yard where her hot tub had once stood. The days that followed were peaceful in a way that felt unfamiliar. The air was lighter. Kids played louder. Neighbors waved more freely. Someone even suggested starting a new community group, one without rigid rules and anonymous complaint. They wanted to call it Neighbors for Sanity. I didn't join, but I appreciated the spirit. One evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, I stood in the spot where the hot tub had once been. The grass had begun to regrow, uneven and patchy, but alive. I thought about planting a tree there, something sturdy and slow-growing, something with roots too deep for anyone to move. Later that week, a knock came at my door. It was Dennis, the former HOA president. He handed me a small envelope and said it was from the board, now reorganized and operating under new rules. Inside was a thank you card. Handwritten. No HOA stamp. No official seal. Just a simple message that said thanks for standing up and staying calm when everyone else wanted to scream. I nodded, tucked the card away, and closed the door. And just like that, the neighborhood healed. Not overnight, but steadily. The fence stayed up. The cameras stayed on. But more importantly, the peace stayed too. Karen's reign was over, not because someone outshouted her, but because someone outlasted her, documented her, and never once stooped to her level. Entitlement is loud, but truth is patient. And sometimes, it takes one bubble-filled disaster to remind a whole neighborhood that respect is stronger than authority, and boundaries, once drawn, aren't so easily washed away.